welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Real Life by Brandon Taylor. Last episode, we gave a general overview of real life. This episode, we will focus on the first half of the novel.
Welcome back, y'all. We're gonna submerge ourselves into the first half of Brandon Taylor's novel today, and we have a lot of ground to cover. But it's only the first three chapters, but it's about halfway through the novel. Last time we had gone over some of the themes, some of the characters, some of the writing style, but we're gonna just kick things off with the very beginning. I know you, Vanessa, had mentioned that you wanted to discuss the opening scene.
Yes. So these first 3 pages really give a good overview of the setting and who Wallace is and why how he looks at the world, and especially since one of the first sentences is announcing to us that his father passed away several weeks ago.
Yeah, I think last episode you mentioned Gatsby. I guess is kind of like a reference, and that first paragraph kind of reminds me like the endlessly ceasing waves. The description of the environment, I guess, and it just he has this way of also thinking about the internal world, his internal world, in contrast with the outside world. I guess real life, as you were saying, like the way he describes everyone, and there's this insular nature to it, right? Like a contrast of his world, I guess, and then just the way he describes other groups of people around, and they're like in their groups. He says other groups of other white people, right? Because he's looking for his particular group of white people, which I think is so a fascinating way of doing it. And yeah, spot on, Vanessa. This is a nice introduction to his kind of inner thoughts of perceiving the world around him.
Yeah, and it's also kind of what you just mentioned, that it's the narrator is highlighting that they're white, and so that's important for our protagonist, because he's black, and it's something that we'll talk about later on in some other scenes. Beyond the setting that makes it very you get that immediate, even though we're somewhere in the Midwest, it seems like almost like a New England quality to it, or like Maine or something, one of Stephen King's novels. What else, Vanessa, in the opening chapter did you want to highlight?
So this one also really showcases the relationships that Wallace has with everyone. So initially, when we're first introduced to Miller, I really like the way that it's described on page 13. So the relationship doesn't necessarily stay this way, but it's the way that we're first introduced to Miller. So they kind of are passive aggressive towards one another, or they'll make little comments to one another. And it ends up with them just being sort of distant. And the way that it's described is it says, "And they fell into that chilly silence that comes between two people who ought to be close, but who are not because of some early critical miscalculation."
Yeah, why did you like that strong line? And kind of even outside of that context, like, with Miller in particular, like Miller and Wallace, I mean.
I think it's interesting because later their relationship changes, but they're at this moment, they don't really talk. There's like, I guess you could say that they're civil with one another, but they wouldn't consider each other friends.
Yeah. And then the narrator also tells us that both of them had been the first in their families to go to college, right? So no, they're first generation. And we've covered a lot of works already where we get like first generation, college students. So it's kind of interesting when we get that with them too. And it kind of maybe presents a way for them to bond as well.
Right, the narrator acknowledges, like, that's another great line, because it acknowledges that they ought to be close. There's those
Yeah,
similarities
they
where,
have a lot in
and so
common.
it kind of maybe does foreshadow them getting closer.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, you mentioned this very human element where sometimes you just get off to the wrong start, and
Hmm.
even though it shouldn't be that way, like you kind of keep some distance, emotional
Mm-hmm.
distance between people
Hmm.
early on.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of the James Joyce style of
Mm.
capturing the, seemingly um, you know n- um, standard scenes right here, like a dinner party,
Uh-huh.
and it reminds me a lot in particular of like The Dead, his short story The Dead. Um,
Hmm.
so I had one on page 32, but I think you probably had one before that. Vanessa?
I just have one on page 30. It's, I guess, the second paragraph. Um, I really like this description of like that feeling right before you're about to start crying. So it says, there was a knot of tension high in his chest, something hard and coiled. It felt like a black ball stuck to the inside of his lungs. His stomach hurt too. He had eaten nothing but soup all day. The surface of his hunger was rough, like a cat's tongue. Pressure gathered in the back of his eyes. Oh, he thought when he realized what it was. Tears.
Yeah, and we talked about this last time with the style of Brandon's writing, that he's
Mhm.
able to capture these emotions and feelings really
Yeah.
well, right? And
Yes.
like really describe them precisely. Um, and here, when talking about the fact that his father had died, it I think it can apply to any kind of situation where, like you said, like you kind of have like you might have someone might have like a panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you do kind of feel like that, and all the more so because it's a social situation, right? So he kind of has to like keep it inside too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so here in particular, this is a scene where Emma comes in, and Emma is where she's described as having an olive complexion on page 31, but she is white, except we're told that her grandparents are like Czech, and then on one side, and then a Sicilian on the other. But because they're not a white men, we're told that that's one way that Emma and Wallace can bond. And we talked about academia and how toxic it can become, and I think it's important to note that that's one way that they are able to bond.
Mm.
On page 32 is where I had my passage, and I think you had this one too, right, Vanessa?
I might think so.
So you know what, Emma picks up that something is wrong, and just Wallace blurts out, or Wally as they come to call him, my dad died. And Emma tells him, I'm sorry, Wallace, I'm sorry for your loss. And the narrator says he smiled because he was not sure how to meet someone's sympathy for him. It always seemed to him that when people were sad for you, they were sad for themselves, as if your misfortune were just an excuse for them to feel what it was they wanted to feel. Sympathy was a kind of ventriloquism. His father had died hundreds of miles away. Wallace had not told anyone. His brother had called him. Then came the social media posts, those concerned and those just after, that ugly, frothing spectacle of public mourning. It was strange, Wallace thought as he smiled at Emma, because he didn't feel a crushing sense of loss. No. When he thought of his father's death, he felt the way he always felt when someone didn't show up for lab. But perhaps that wasn't the truth of it either. He didn't know what to feel, and so he tried not to feel anything. It seemed more honest that way, a real feeling. More a very introspective look at the way that Wallace is feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like this description as well, because it shows how when someone tells you someone died, kind of that social expectation
Mm-hmm.
on your behalf as someone who is supposed to be mourning, and then also on behalf of the person who is expressing their condolences. I think it's really accurate,
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes people are kind of just trying to. It's kind of like he said, right, like a kind of ventriloquism. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I underlined that line. Sympathy was a kind of ventriloquism.
Mm-hmm.
It also shows you, again, like how he sees things. Like, it shows
Hmm.
you how he's feeling, and he shows you what he thinks of certain things.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's an authenticity to that, and I like that he kind of decides for himself to just accept the confusion rather than force himself
Hmm.
to you know, maybe there are deeper feelings there that maybe aren't quite there yet, but you know, for now it's like I have nothing to offer but my own confusion, and that's a certain kind of acceptance too.
Yeah. And we as readers are become more curious because we don't know exactly why he feels this way as of yet. Um, and it also reminded me of running because of social media, right?
Mm.
And it's kind of interesting how with social media, the public mourning ritual has changed a bit,
Yeah.
because like I don't know, like do you kind of feel a need to publicize it, but at the same time you also kind of want that privacy, right? And it goes back to running, how the private and public
Yeah.
diverge.
So it's a weird space because you can even be criticized for not making a big deal about it somehow,
Mm-hmm.
or mentioning it.
Right.
Yeah, that public space, it's so weird. You know, from a personal standpoint, I've seen there's been at least 2 or 3 of my peers that have passed away in the last couple months. Um and you know, you talk about the weird public spectacle of private mourning, you know, all those posts turn into the my sympathies, thoughts and prayers, you know, like and when it becomes a wall, something about it just does seem kind of weird. And then you have the people who just kind of want to know what happened, what
Mm-hmm.
happened. And it's one of those things, well, like this is not time to ask that stuff. And it's such a weird confusing space. So it's interesting to look at that little moment,
Mm-hmm.
something that maybe we've all experienced in some way.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And we come to find that he didn't actually attend the funeral. And at first Emma thinks that it's Simone, whom they call the quote unquote she demon, who runs the lab. But it's not because of that. And we looked at a lot of funerals, if y'all remember, at in Everything Begins and Ends at the Kentucky Club. So it's kind of interesting how here it's the absence of one that um his absence in one that kind of produces more, they're not really probing, well, why not, and things like that, right? I
Mhm.
mean, they're just thinking it's like understandable. um what else did you have after that, Vanessa?
Well, I just wanted to touch on one thing on page 34.
Mm-hmm.
In that first paragraph, when he's talking about what people expect of you when you lose someone in your family.
Mm-hmm.
They thought that things had to be a certain way with family. They thought you had to feel something for them, and it had to be the same thing that everyone felt, or else you were doing it wrong. How could he laugh at the thought of not going to his own father's funeral? How strange could he be? Wallace did not think he was strange. He did not think he was wrong or bad for laughing either, but he made his face into a calm mask of quiet, still sadness.
Yeah, what did you think about that?
I think it goes back to what we were just saying earlier about how people think you're supposed to react a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Or people think they're supposed to react a certain way when you tell them that you lost someone.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost like he seems that it would not be genuine, right? That if he simply cries about it, yes, he'll get sympathy, but it's just it's fake, right?
Mm.
And so I think there's more to be said about him reckoning with that honesty, and that even though they say blood is thicker than water, there's more under the surface here than meets the eye. Um, and here it's also kind of interesting socially, and I think we had talked about this briefly last episode with Tom, who's Emma's partner, because to console, so consolation after you tell someone died, that they died, you kind of just give their condolences, and if they're in person, there's more intimate ways of doing that. But so Emma kisses Wallace in the mouth, and Tom sees that, right? And then he gets super jealous. But then, of course, we know that Wallace is gay, and so that's one thing they mention. And so after he finds that out, he kind of just backs off. But it's kind of interesting how Tom just kind of loses it at first after finding out that after seeing them, kiss in the mouth. Um, so it is kind of an interesting dynamic, of how is it that Emma's showing affection towards Wallace because of it. And besides Emma and Tom, there's also, as you mentioned, Miller. And so they're having dinner, right? And then Miller ends up getting like salt in his eye, right? Or what was it?
No, he gets like jalapenos. They're
Jalapeno.
like they call them. They said peppers, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, like nachos and stuff that they were eating.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you had 41, but on 41, it's a very interesting scene because here at the top, so milk, right? He's using milk to kind of, help his eye, stop crying and all that, and burning. And it says, Wallace twisted the cap from the milk bottle and held it over Miller's eyes. His hands shook. A drop of milk fell from the lip of the bottle and landed on Miller's cheek, just below his eyelashes. Wallace swallowed. He watched Miller breathe. He watched Miller wet the corner of his mouth. Water dripped from the tap. So in this scene, Wallace has offered to help him clean out his eye. But I read this scene in a very essential way. The symbolism of the milk, the fact that he's kind of pouring it over him into his eyes and his face, and then that Miller himself kind of wets his mouth. It's all very essential, and it kind of foreshadows ultimately what is end up going to happen, what ends up happening here with Miller and Wallace. But I think it also shows that Wallace is a good guy. He doesn't have to help him, but he does, and it's I think also something like kind of it can be awkward, but the way that the two do it, it just seems very harmonious, and I think that speaks to like the chemistry that they have between them. Did you have, Vanessa, like the scene where they end up getting together once they both decide to leave the party?
No.
No. If you all turn to page 51, so they both end up leaving, Wallace first, and then Miller follows. And even though they both live in different directions, Miller ends up, getting together with Wallace here. And it's all very it's a little awkward at first, precisely because Miller mentions that he's never been with someone of the same gender here. So it mentions here, Wallace couldn't remember the last time he had lain with someone this way, in that nearly innocent configuration that comes before sex when both parties pretend to want everything other than that, letting their bodies wind up to the point of unbearable tension. Wallace was, and here at the bottom, Wallace was determined to give Miller what nobody had thought to give him, determined that at the end of this, whatever it was, Miller wouldn't learn to fear his body or what it could contain. Miller's fingers dug into his hair as his head bobbed between Miller's thigh. He took Miller deeper into his throat, and there was a final strangled gasp. And this not only started with him helping him, get that out of get his eyes better, but at the end, I don't know if y'all remember, but Miller reaches out to Wallace and like he ends up holding his hand. And so it's a very tender moment that Miller apologizes for at first, but Wallace, understands. And the way that the scene is set up, I really liked, as we talked about last time, the sensuality of it, because he's able to show that Wallace isn't being pushy. And I think that's very important in any kind of relationship, or you know any kind of sexual encounter in this case, because especially Miller, right? He kind of was apprehensive about it, but Wallace is able to make him feel comfortable and not force something, right, that isn't going to be genuine. So just wanted to mention that scene. Um, After that, I had one on 55.
My next one's not until 81.
Okay. So 55, I just want to mention briefly because after that sexual encounter, it's also interesting how Miller is able to bond more with Wallace, because Miller mentions that his mom died 2 years ago, he says here. And then, kind of the same thing with Wallace, right? He says on the bottom of 54, what I know is that it doesn't matter if you didn't know them or they didn't know you. My mom was a real bitch. She was mean, hateful, a liar, and spent my whole life tearing me down. When she died, I don't know. Your parents aren't people until they're suffering. They aren't people until they're gone. And then, expressing more connection here on 55 with Wallace, he says, I can't tell you what to do about your dad. I can't tell you what to feel, Wallace, but I'm here if you need me. I'm your friend if you need me. And then he kind of just reflects on the whole situation and says, Miller lay on top of him and drew the blanket over. And Wallace, for the first time, let someone inside him. It hurt at first, like it always did, but that pain and the joy of his body remembering its keenest pleasure was enough to get him hard again. And through it, Miller was easy on him, but we knew what he wanted, and he pursued it relentlessly. They were both grieving hard by the time it was over. I don't know if you remember, he has gone to be with a woman, but it reminded me a lot of Jose Luis and Javier, I think are their names, in the sense that they also, ended up cooking up together, and they were both gay. And it was kind of a similar situation where they were talking about the loss of life, like their uncle. And eventually, that ended up them bonding together. So I think it's important to note how Miller expressing how his mom died, it's a very similar kind of situation where the parent is distant, and the point of like how you don't know that they're suffering until they're gone, right? So even though like if someone has like crappy parents, it's like you lose them and you still feel it,
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately that is what ends up them having sex here again, where there is penetration involved.
Yeah, there's like a vulnerability and sharing that grief,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of space, and it's an openness that allows them to, you know, find solace, in each other.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly that vulnerability, right? Like
Mhm.
Wallace from the very beginning has had trouble opening up, but it's by sharing the loss of life of someone close to them that they are able to bond.
Having that similar experience too, I think,
Mm-hmm.
helps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I guess it helps you not feel alone.
Yeah. What did you have after that, Vanessa? Was it still chapter 1? Is that you had?
No, I don't think so. No, it's in chapter 2.
Okay. So what did you have in chapter 2?
On page 81.
Mm-hmm.
It's the paragraph where they're talking about money and all of the different, how they're basically all watching one another to see who's doing what. So it says, money is always on their minds. Who got the big departmental fellowship? Miller. Whose advisor had a grant rejected? Lucas. Which lab receives private research dollars? Wallace's. Whose project is likely to translate well to industry? Ingves. Who will grab the job at Brandy's? Caroline. Who will take the job at MIT? Nora, a postdoc in Yisingvai's
Hmm.
lab. Who is maybe leaving for Harvard? Cole's advisor. For Columbia, Emma's advisor. For UT Southwestern, no one. So yeah, I really like how it describes like this person's doing this and this person's not doing this.
Hmm. It also talks about, like you said, that the competitiveness, right? You know, that yes, you have to work together in the lab as a team.
Mm-hmm.
But as we come to find out with Dana, especially, right? Like it's super, people can be super envious of you if like, and totally even like sabotage your work, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I also like a little at the bottom there where it says, fellowships lead to good postdocs lead to good grants lead to faculty positions, more or less commensurate with the stature of one's faculty advisor, right? It all rises and falls on money. And we come to find that Wallace has like a big stipend, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
he's able to like live relatively comfortably. And it's a scene where like, you know, if anyone's, you know, the scene where like you have to like be super gracious to someone who has sponsored you, right? Like one of your
Yeah.
donors,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so it's kind of a funny little moment there. Um, and I think what I also found interesting is like how different their journeys are. You know, everyone seems to be going to a different place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think chapter 2, was it Vanessa that had mentioned Henrik as well, right? Already.
I believe so.
Yeah,
Yes.
I know we had mentioned them already in the first episode. Um, but he ends up at Vassar, I think. So he does manage to mentor Wallace and like teach him a lot of different ways to conduct these lab experiments that really get now down into the science of you know, biochemistry and but so he's kind of not there anymore, but we do find about him through those flashbacks. We had mentioned Dana last time as well,
Yes.
and I know you probably have a passage or two. I had one on a little back here on 75 because Dana is the youngest from the lab. Like in other words, she's the newest one. And on 75 here, the big paragraph, it says, you know, Wallace is kind of complaining about how like she's not keeping up with the work. And Bridget, who's actually a Chinese American, says it doesn't have to make sense. She's gifted, spitting out Simone's favorite word for Dana, but meaning the opposite. Wallace laughs. Gifted is a sweetness meant to make the bitterness of failure palatable. That a person can fail again and again, but it's all right because they're gifted. They're worth something. Wallace thinks that if the world has made up its mind about what you have to offer, if the world has decided it wants you, needs you, then it doesn't matter how many times you mess up. What Wallace wants to know is where the limit is. When is it no longer forgivable to be terrible? When does the time come you've got to deliver on your gifts? It's a really interesting meditation on how someone gets that gifted label, right? Like in high school, you have the gifted and talented, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and GT or whatever. And all of a sudden, because of that, instead of actually being a way for like you to mentor others because you're gifted, right, quote unquote, Dana, you know, everyone kind of knows that about Dana, and Dana kind of uses that to her advantage, right? That she's allowed these chances, second and third chances, that Wallace becomes very resentful of. And Vanessa, I don't know if you had like a specific moment from this chapter about that.
Mine was on page 95, but I don't know if you have something before that.
90, just 90.
95.
Okay, yeah. For me, it was just 90.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so just a little before that, and I have 95 as well. But I like the imagery here. So we had mentioned that the bird on the cover, and there's a lot of avian imagery in the novel. I really like this meditation here. Outside, there are birds in the pine tree across the street. Small dark birds fluttering near the top of the tree. How strange to be a bird, Wallace thinks, to have the world beneath you, that inversion of scale, what is small becoming large, what is large becoming small, the way a bird can move where it wants in space, no dimension unconquerable. He feels at mercy at being left alone. Um, I just like that little scene where, he's kind of feeling like a bird in some sense, but yet he's also aware of like how birds do have that freedom.
Hmm.
Um, but a little after that, you said you had 95.
Yes.
So I think here they get into an argument, right?
Yes. So he kind of asks her, well, he says that he heard a rumor that she messed up his project.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's like, well, did you? And she's like, I can't believe you would think that. He's like, well, I didn't say that that's what I thought. I was just asking you.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't think that. And so they get into an argument. And she ends up calling him a misogynist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting how she says that, because he tells her that he's not a misogynist, and she says, you don't get to define what misogyny is to a woman. And then she later on says, if I say you're a misogynist, then you're a misogynist. And I feel like that's a really terrible argument,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like that's the approach that a lot of people take when they're arguing, is just to insult the other person.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't think that how she says that,
Mm-hmm.
if she says it, then that's what it is.
Right.
I don't agree with that. I feel like she's saying, like, I get to define the word because I'm a woman,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think that that's correct. I think that the word already has a definition,
Mm-hmm.
so the person either falls into the category or they don't.
Right.
And I feel like she's kind of, because he came and asked her that, she's using it and she's saying, this is what I'm labeling you as.
Mm-hmm.
It's a precarious kind of labeling for sure,
Mm-hmm.
It is a rough thing to like argue, like, if you're a man, like, I'm not, like, well, stop, man, you can't
Yeah.
mansplain misogyny kind
Mm-hmm.
of type thing. Her logic is kind of weird too, right? Because right after that, she kind of uses this reasoning of like, you're a gay black guy, and you want to use it as like and again,
Right.
he's like, I don't, but it's kind of we see a lot of identity politics coming out in this argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing for her to call him a misogynist, which is even more extreme than just saying he's being sexist. But it's wholly another thing to say that, like, because he is gay and black, like, she somehow thinks he gets a free pass because of it, right? When the opposite is true. And I think you mentioned last time, Vanessa, that Dana kind of reminded you of Haley from Hate You Give.
Yes.
Yeah. And it gets even worse, right? Because on the next page, on page page 96, she says that like women are the new N's and the new F's, right? Both very derogatory terms. And that's where like Wallace practically loses it. But as a black man, I think he's also able to internalize the rage. And I think that's very important when it comes to people who are black and African American, is that these kinds of encounters and microaggressions, you have to remain calm because like someone might have a gun, right? Or someone might call the police on you. But the nerve of Dana just using both those terms in a way that is actually meant to put him down, by saying that women are just unique and that they're the new oppressed ones, right? That she's looking to find a new kind of oppression while using oppressive terms for black people and gay people. And I really like in the next page 97 was mine, where he meditates on how Simone, I get why they call her the she demon, because Simone apparently always takes Zayn aside and pretty much implies that Wallace is only there, like he's getting chances because he, like, I guess that they consider him like the affirmative action hire in a way. But he says here on the page 97, um, and Simone also implies that because he's black, like he's not doing a good job, right? That she's being racist too. But he says, the most unfair part of it, Wallace thinks, is that when you tell white people that something is racist, they'd hold it up to the light and try to discern if you're telling the truth, as if they can tell by the grain if something is racist or not. And they always trust their own judgment. It's unfair because white people have a vested interest in underestimating racism, its amount, its intensity, its shape, its effects. They are the fox in the hen house. I think it's a really important and brilliant point on the part of Wallace in terms of how it's important to note that white people don't get to define what is racist, and that sometimes they use that against you, right? Because they say, well, I'm not being racist, right? It's people of color who can determine that. And so it's kind of, you really sympathize here with Wallace, like everything he's going through, these encounters. Did you have another one after that, Vanessa? In the same chapter, or?
No.
Yeah, my next one was 111.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Yeah? Okay. So in chapter 3, so after that whole encounter with Dana and Simone, chapter 3 is where Cole and Wallace have a discussion while playing tennis about how Vincent is apparently like exploring the online world. And so it says here, like Cole mentions, Wallace mentions the gay app, you mean? And that's it. Yeah, Cole says. And he says here, Cole has always made sure to mention that he is not on the app and that he's relieved to have found Vincent before the app and such technology. Geolocation, finding the nearest queers for fucking or whatever. Wallace always has to keep himself from saying that Cole would have done well on the app. He is tall and good looking in an average sort of way. He's funny and quippy, gentle. He is also white, which is never a disadvantage with gay men. But Wallace says none of these things because to say them would disrupt Cole's view of the average gay man as shallow and kind of stupid. They are shallow and kind of stupid, but no more than any other group. Wallace only deleted the app because he had grown tired of watching himself be invisible to them. And he says, I saw Vincent on there last night. I suspected he was on there, so I made a fake profile. So it's interesting how Wallace doesn't actually share that with him, but we of course find out through that narration how he feels about Cole, and it's kind of an interesting discussion on like how this dating app that is made for those in the LGBTQ community, how Cole would fit in because he is white. So I just found that really interesting, and how, I don't know enough about that universe to be able to, talk about it and from experience, but it seems that like there's a lot of like interracial dynamics that come into play when it comes to that. And Vincent himself, if you remember, Vanessa and Richie, he the reason he was on the app is because this person named Roman, who was like a French dude, he brought up this idea of like, well, what if you watch your partner have sex? And so he brings up this element of like being in an open relationship, I guess you could call it. And that kind of just, puts this idea into Vincent's head. And so Wallace kind of tries to be comforting, about that. But what passage did you have around, or did you have something after that?
I have 122. So As Wallace and Cole are talking, Cole is trying to figure out how he can address the situation with Vincent. And Wallace is telling him that he has to talk to him about it, like he can't just avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he tells him towards the middle of the page, he says, "People do this. They fight. They hide things. They argue. It means you're in something that's worth giving a damn about." And I really like that description of relationships because I do feel like it's like a give and a take.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
if, yeah,
go ahead.
sorry. I was
No.
just going to add that, like, if you don't feel like if you don't fight for it, you probably don't want it that bad.
Mm.
And so I really like that he described the relationship like that.
Yeah, throughout this whole encounter, I really like that Wallace is able to kind of provide the really interesting advice, really good advice, and also kind of help Cole understand, well, don't just assume that like he's cheating on you, right? Although there's that passage where Cole mentions that looking is cheating, right? That like you
Yes.
don't even have to get with someone. But even for that, Wallace has an explanation, right? And I think he mentions like, well, like, have you thought about how maybe you haven't communicated with him about this? Because he mentions that like Vincent brought it up, but Cole wanted nothing to do with it, right? So like he didn't even consider having an argument about it. And so this goes back to Wallace's point, about that. Well, like you sometimes do have to argue with someone, right? Because it shows you do care. And then on the next page, on page 126, he talks about he flashes back to the scene where Roman says that phrase, about how if your boyfriend is watching, that's the best, right? And Wallace offers this up at the bottom, where, I mean, it doesn't flash back. Cole is just telling him what happened, and the narrator says, Wallace bites the tip of his tongue, which is already so raw today. He swallows down what he wants to say. That a person doesn't belong to you just because you're in a relationship, just because you love them. That people are people and they belong only to themselves, or so they should. Miller can do whatever he wants with whomever he wants, is the thought that flashes through. He has a jealous heart. Love is a selfish thing. This reminds me a lot of Ben Science's work, because Ben Science also talks about love in a similar way. And here, it's also another interesting argument that Wallace makes, that again, this time he doesn't actually tell him that directly, right? He just kind of implies it by asking, well, what does Vincent think about this? But it's kind of an interesting concept that like when someone is in a relationship that you don't possess them, right? And I think that's hard to do in like traditional monogamous relationships. But it's something that shows Wallace's open-mindedness when it comes to relationships.
I also underlined that little paragraph.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's we're getting a clear picture of the kind of person that Wallace is. And he seems to be very inquisitive, very understanding, very sensual, and just very hardworking too, given by what he's doing in the lab. He seems to be like working twice as hard to, unlike Dana, right, who seems to be getting off just because she's gifted. So this is the first half of the novel roughly, but we're going to keep going this discussion. So if you haven't been able to catch the book yet, you still got time. And we might be setting up an opportunity for you all to send us questions. So keep track, watch our social media space for ways that you can maybe send us questions ahead of time for discussion. And we gladly love to be able to take those questions of yours, even if you haven't read the book, but maybe just based on our discussion of it.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing Real Life by Brandon Taylor. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.